welcome back. Thanks for watching. So glad you're here. Steve Deal with Forgiveness Ministries. I want to talk for a few moments and share with you about the three paths of forgiveness. In another video, I talked about the three paths of sin, that sins travel in three different directions. We sin against God, other people sin against us, and we sin against other people. I want to emphasize and talk a little bit more about the corresponding paths of forgiveness. We need to learn how to receive fully God's forgiveness of us. That's the first path of forgiveness. The second path is we need to learn how to forgive effectively the people who sin against us, so our hurt and our anger is gone and God heals us and sets us free. And the third path of forgiveness is we need to learn how to ask and to do it sincerely the people we have sinned against to forgive us. As we practice these three paths of forgiveness, God heals us and He sets us free. And this is the foundation then for restoring broken relationships. And I'll talk more about this in future videos, but especially when we get into the how-tos. But I want to introduce to you this concept here. It's important that when we practice these three paths of forgiveness, that we practice them in the order that I just presented them. In any relationship you are in where sin has been going back and forth, a human relationship, you always want to make sure that you identify your sins against God in that relationship first and receive His forgiveness before you try to forgive that person. And then you need to forgive the other person of the sins they have committed against you before you go and ask them to forgive you. This is important because each path of forgiveness has its own area or level of healing in your soul. And as you receive God's forgiveness for your sins against Him, and all sins against other people are first and foremost a sin against God, who told us and made us to love one another. When we don't love one another, we're sinning against God first and foremost. So every sin against another human being is first and foremost a sin against God. And that's where our practice of forgiveness must start. We need to confess our sin to God, receive His forgiveness, because when we do, He heals our soul in a particular way that prepares us and allows us to be better equipped to forgive the other person of their sins against us. And in the same way, when we forgive the other person who has sinned against us, we are healed in such a way and become better prepared to be able to sincerely and honestly confess our sin to them and ask them to forgive us. You see, if you don't practice these three paths of forgiveness in that order, receiving God's forgiveness, forgiving other people, asking the other person to forgive you, then what may happen is something like this. If you go and ask someone to forgive you before you have received God's forgiveness for that sin, you're going to be hoping and expecting, and your soul is going to be crying out for this person to give you something, to forgive you, and to give you something, a healing, a confidence, a freedom that only God can give you. And so you will beg and ask and hope and maybe even demand, maybe even try to manipulate them to forgive you so that you can get your needs met. Now that's a sin if you do it in that way. But if you receive God's forgiveness first, and He heals you and He sets you free, and your guilt is gone and your shame is gone, and you have confidence, then in love you can go to the person you sinned against and ask them to forgive you, more for their sake and their healing than for your sake. And when you don't forgive the other person before you ask them to forgive you, you're very likely to sound something like this. Well, I need to ask you to forgive me of my sin that I committed against you. But And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people use that word but when they're asking someone to forgive them. There should be no word but when you're asking someone to forgive you. There is no excuse, there is no justification. And when we haven't forgiven the other person, if God hasn't relieved us of our anger towards that person, our heart's cry for justice, when we ask for forgiveness of them, we're going to say, hey, I sinned against you, but you sinned against me, and you need to make it right. And it's not my fault only, it's your fault too. And brothers and sisters, that's not asking for forgiveness. That's actually using a smoke screen and making yourself look more righteous than the other person. I'm going to ask you for forgiveness, but what I really want to do is point out how wrong you are, and I need and want to see you suffer for what you did to me. You see, this is why it's so important that we receive God's forgiveness first, so that we can be freed up and healed, so that we can forgive the other person second, so that we can be healed and freed up and enabled to ask them to forgive us. These three paths of forgiveness are extremely important, and only practicing one or two of them isn't going to allow God to do all of the healing that you long for in your life. It isn't going to allow for the restoration of broken relationships that might be possible if we practice all three paths of forgiveness in the right order. So we need to learn how to fully receive God's forgiveness, effectively forgive other people, and sincerely ask other people to forgive us. And as we practice those three paths of forgiveness, God will do amazing, miraculous things in your life beyond your imagination in healing your soul and setting you free. Thank you for watching. Press the subscribe button so that you can know when new videos come out. And I pray and hope that you will watch all the videos and that God will guard you in these lessons, that He will be your teacher and your guide, that He will comfort you and strengthen you and enable you to enter fully into His wonderful gift of forgiveness. Go to our website, forgivenessministries.org, see what resources are there for you to take advantage of. These videos are just a part of the ministry of Forgiveness Ministries. We want to help as many people as possible develop a lifestyle of truly authentic biblical forgiveness and to become messengers of that ministry and that message to all the people in their lives, in their families, in their churches, in their communities, in this world. Because if everybody practiced forgiveness, this would be a radically different world, a world that we might love to live in. Thanks for watching. God bless you.